Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Craig Parkinson, who will be joining us as our resident expert.
Hi there.
And also to introduce Katie, and Katie will be joining us a little bit later.
Hi, everyone.
Right, so we've been working with Craig for, I don't know how long, Craig, now, 10, 12 years, something like that?
Yeah, it's the decade, the decade's up. So a lot's happened in that time. A lot's happened in the last year, of course, as well.
Absolutely, and our understanding of education has really deepened during that time. So really exciting today. And what we're exploring today is visible learning, and we're looking at that nature of the intentional development behind it. Because I think a lot of John Hattie's work is seen as just the effect sizes, and then everyone starts arguing, why that effect size, and what about the EEF? And what we're going to try and do is get behind it, because John Hattie wasn't just doing the effect sizes and that research. He was also doing all the research into leadership. He was doing all the research into scalability and how you actually develop things strategically, and works with about 25 governments around the world on doing this. And I think Katie was just saying earlier that Austria have now adopted visible learning, or that framework behind visible learning, as their major curriculum. So we're going to deep dive into this, pull it apart a little bit, and use Craig's first-hand expertise of having worked with schools over these 10 years and groups of schools on that journey, and what it's looked like, and how it can look quite differently from each different entity within it, I think. Yeah,
Definitely. It's 10 years ago when I did my first work, which was on a little island school in Mull. I went to a school. I travelled by ferry to get there. And I thought, I've discovered a school here that's so different from everywhere else. And after 10 years, I've discovered that schools are way more similar than they are different. And something like visible learning, it doesn't act as a blueprint where schools all start off from the same starting point. They all just start off where they start off from. And then we work at how to sort of really leverage as much impact as we possibly can on learners based on where the school's strengths are, and building those strengths up.
I think that's the thing that we're increasingly realizing, that the learner, be it the teacher, be it the school, they're all going to start off at a different point, and it doesn't really matter what that point is. Okay. It's what you do from that point and the understanding from that point, which gets exciting. So please, fill in with a chat with your name, where you're from, and any questions you've got and stuff, and we'll pick those up, and I'll ping those on to Craig. But I'm just going to start off with Craig with the cynic question: why visible learning? Why learning rather than teaching or instruction?
Absolutely, and I think when people hear cynic, they sometimes think about cynical, but obviously Simon Sinek's work, where you start with your why. One thing that schools quickly realise, because they're such busy places, that their core business is learning, and sometimes that gets moved away from the centre of their desk to somewhere else. Other things come along. So if we start out with the why of visible learning, why would you do it? It's, well, because your school is a place where people come to learn. That is the core business. So then you want to build back from there. So if that's why we're doing it, to put learning at the heart and keep it there, then what is how we're going to bring that about? And visible learning, its aim isn't to say get rid of everything and do all these things in order. It just says, let's look at what are the key things that you need to focus on. What's your capacity to do these things, and what's your capability like at being able to deliver these things, so that when you get to the what, what's going to look differently. Teachers are going to be able to see learning from the learner's perspective a lot more, taking feedback from them to really understand where they're at. And pupils are going to be able to look in a mirror and see a consummate learner there and say, I am a learner. I am in charge of my learning. My teacher's job is to cause learning, and I'm here to make that learning sort of come to its, its final finishing point.
So can we unpick that term learning? Because it's been one of the hardest. I mean, we've been doing this for 25 years at Osiris Educational. And the one term that really does get people going is learning, and really understanding what it is. So I'll just tell you what my understanding is, and perhaps you can broaden this one a little bit. So we've definitely got two elements. The first element sits around the curriculum, or the design of what we're trying to learn, be that the factual knowledge, or be that the procedural knowledge. So we are saying yes to curriculum within it. And then secondly, I understand it to be the development of the learner themselves and their understanding of themselves as a learner. And I know there's some key parts in that. Would you like to add bits on within that?
Absolutely. And I think the key driver in terms of developing learning and enhancing and emphasizing learning within schools is the learning process. And this is the thing that's hidden most often, because if you're a student in a secondary school, then you're exposed to many different managers of learning, who all probably have some type of learning process that they lean towards and want to emphasize in the classroom. A primary pupil, obviously, is just with one expert all day long. But when pupils start being able to acknowledge that they have a process of learning, and it's not visual, auditory, kinesthetic, it's how we move from where I'm at to where I'm trying to get to, and navigate that path. When pupils become aware of this process and then take charge of it, then we really do develop that second part that you referred to, Stephen, which is the sort of metacognitive aspect of the pupil. In terms of the first part, it doesn't really matter which curriculum you're sort of learning within. Kings and Queens of England, Kings and Queens of Narnia, you know, learning is the same no matter where it is. So the curriculum is the vehicle that allows you to get, to utilize your learning process. But when you reflect on your learning process, that's when you can start being able to take charge of it a lot more. John Dewey said it, didn't he? We don't learn from experience. We just learn when we reflect on our experiences.
And I think this is quite kind of fundamental, because a lot of people kind of move towards problem-based learning or challenge-based learning and stuff like that, and expect the learning just to happen. And I know I did a lot of research in this area for about 8 years. We were looking to see what was happening. And even if you went back to Carl Rogers' work in the 1970s, they were saying only 30% of learners really are geared up to learn in that way. So we can't just switch over and say, off you go and run with it. You know, we've got 70-80% of learners who are going to struggle in that scenario and be tested out unless we deliberately develop that. So what you're saying there is, yes, you can have progressions within the curriculum, really important, but you can also have progressions within the composites that make up learning as well.
Definitely. And when you look at the feedback model that gets some sort of airtime through visible learning, this instructional model of feedback, that has two purposes. One is to close an instructional gap, which is a curricular gap. And the other one is to develop greater levels of self-regulation in the learner. So feedback can do both of those things. It can move pupils through the curriculum, and when done really well, it can get the pupil to be more in charge of making progress. We'd say cognition allows you to make progress. Metacognition allows you to control your progress.
Nice. I like the way you've pulled that one out there as well. So, right, we're going to, so that's the why. And I think also COVID's really shone a light on the fact that people who've been doing learning, and certainly the visible learning schools we've been working across the UK and other schools from across the world, have been reporting that language of learning has been fundamental for them to continue and be able to have really good progress with their kids, irrespective of what's happening. Whereas what we're seeing is teachers where teaching has been overemphasized, or what I would call over teaching, that's become more problematical because it's harder to control the conditions around it. And if you look then straight into a lifetime learning concept, obviously those conditions are uncontrollable.
Absolutely. That mantra that you see there about pupils seeing themselves as their own teachers, that is so that pupils are able to take their learning superpower and apply it wherever they go next. And there's always a next. Learning, as we know, sort of never finishes. The curriculum finishes. There are limits to what you need to learn, during that. But they shouldn't be used to put a lid on what pupils learn and how they learn. But something like the Solow taxonomy, we have surface learning and we have deep learning. Assessments of traditionally privileged surface learning. So teaching is traditionally privileged surface learning as well. But with visible learning, we'd say, let's make sure we privilege the surface, the deep, and then the movement between the two, so that we can have that transfer of learning that Thorndike, talked about many years ago. This visible learning doesn't come out with lots of new shiny things. It just says, of all the new shiny things that have ever been created and put in front of us, which are the ones that add value to learning? And how can we use them to get even better? And one thing we know is that teachers can take on board new things really well. We're not that good at abandoning things.
Yeah, I mean, I'll ask the question of how well they can take things on board as well, when 99% of the time is spent flat out. It doesn't give a lot of headspace in order to be able to take things on. So I guess let's crack in a little bit into visible learning then. What did John understand, and what have we understood about visible learning that makes it different from other programs? I think you've already alluded to the first part, that you begin where you are.
Yeah. Well, the way the program's set up, it's to be a slow release model of change. So traditionally, I suppose we've always had this. Here's a new thing. Let's make it happen. And the fizzle factor of a new thing. We have it in our own kitchens where we buy new appliances and then we put the new appliance away when we're bored of it. This is all about saying, let's get something there and let's keep going back to it and using it. So the first thing that the program does really well is that it sets out to diagnose where the school's starting point is, and it's really thorough in that. We'll have an impact cycle like the one that's on the slide there, where we have the scoping day. Where is your school starting from? And what we look at there is not the things that traditionally schools have looked at. We just say, shine a light on everything that's to do with learning and impact on learning and progress. Where are you at with those things? So we call that a treasure hunt, where we go and look under all the rocks and see what treasures are there. And then as we move through the program, we move through what Professor Hattie calls the DIE cycle, the diagnose, the intervention, what are you going to do, the implementation. And that's a key part. Schools are such busy places. It's hard to get high quality implementation, and the Visible Learning Program brings that about. And the key bit at the end, because when you've got a policy, it works until you put it into practice. Once you put it into practice, you have to sort of navigate it and be adaptable. If you don't evaluate it, how will you know what impact you've had? And that's what the program does so well. It goes from diagnosis, and it's slow release as a model of change all the way through. It says, let's just do a few things really well rather than do 100 things in a sort of mediocre fashion.
Can I just go back to the diagnosis then, and that measurement and that initial engagement with schools? So what are you finding when you go into schools typically? You said there's commonalities and more than the differences, but I'm thinking particularly around that data issue, depending which part of the world you're in right now. What are you finding that schools are good at data-wise in collecting to do with learning, and what bits are kind of getting ignored or being passed?
I think schools are traditionally awash with data, as we know. It's easy to generate more data. A lot of it's not that usable in terms of being able to look at what progress pupils are making and what's happening to the learner. So schools don't really know to what extent pupils are competent and highly consummate learners in an intentional manner. They might have some anecdotal things that say, oh yeah, pupil A and Q over there, they're really really good learners. But what do pupils R and M, what do they need to get them to the next level? So we tend not to be intentional about developing learning within schools, and we don't really have any quantifiable or qualifiable data before we start the program that says this is where pupils are at in terms of being assessment capable learners, and this is what impact we've had on moving them forward.
That's pretty neat. And I think, I'll add a couple of bits on the assessment because it's one that I've been looking at quite closely and working with some people. And one is the way we use the assessment scale. We tend to use this kind of 100% or mark it at 10 or whatever it is scale, but everyone wants to do really well. So we end up with these tests, which are really only judging 20 of the percentiles rather than the whole percentile. So a really good assessment actually pings right in. The average pupil should be getting 50%, and then you can tell an awful lot about it. So, that's just one way that assessments really struggling. And I think the second element that came out very strongly was the lack of a pre-assessment being done in many cases. And then when the end assessment came, it has to relate to the learning. So if you're using external tests, you're kind of invalidating you're moving away from what you've actually been engaging into the learning process. Is that?
Yeah, oh yeah, it's I think the pre-test and post-test, if we look at what things change sort of with a quizzical look on people's faces, is this notion of, so you want me to test the pupils on what we're going to teach them before we teach them. We want to use the same test here that we're going to use at the end. And you say, well, it is one way of doing it because it lets you know the things that you're not going to need to teach your pupils because they already know them. Graham Nuttall's work that says that your class typically collectively together know about 50% of what they're going to learn. You just don't know which 50% it is, and each individual pupil might know about 10% of what they're going to learn. So good diagnosis is good feedback to the teacher about where pupils need to know things and what things we don't need to cover as much. But that pre-test and post-test, I think we've had a tricky relationship with assessments and over-testing, and people think, why add more tests in when we're trying to do fewer testing? But I think as a diagnostic tool, it's one that once teachers use it, they go, oh, I see the value in this now. And then their belief system sort of acknowledges that a little bit.
Okay, can we talk a bit more about the intentionality of the program? Because I think this is quite crucial for schools. When you've got so many agendas, you've already alluded to the fact that there's too much going on there. Oh, it's great. You're going to break it down to for students, for teachers, for leaders. Fantastic. Off you go.
Happy to do that. So the main intent of the program is to have an impact on the pupils fully. And when we come into the school, we don't just say we want to have an impact on some of your pupils. We say we're going to take 3 years to embed this program with you and we'll do this alongside you. And by the end of that time, we want every one of your pupils to be way more competent and way more likely to recognize themselves as what we'd call a visible learner. And that's a pupil who's able to assess where they're at in their learning at that moment in time. They know where they're trying to get to, and they know how they're probably going to get there. They might not know exactly what answer they need or what the finished product's going to look like, but they know a variety of strategies, learning strategies to get them there, and they control that. So that's the intent from the outset. So to build that visible learner, well, it can't just be the pupils that change. Quite often you hear, who wants change? And you ask a crowd, everybody puts their hand up. And then you say, okay, who wants to change? And everybody pops the hand back down, because we all want change to happen, but don't necessarily want to be the instigators of that, or what we'd call a change agent. So we want, the intention is to bring in a language of learning. And it's that Wittgenstein sort of idea that the limits of my universe are the limits of my vocabulary. The more learning language we have within the school, the more that we have the ability to be aware of ourselves as learners, and for the pupils to do that, and to then control that. What actions are you going to bring in that are going to be different? So that's one of the intentions. We take the spotlight away from the teacher and put it onto and the teaching, and put it onto the learner and learning, and that's a much more healthier place to be, because, to be fair, it's the pupils who have got far more at stake in terms of coming to school than anybody else, because the pupils are in this only for those years. The teachers going to see different cohorts time and time again, but those individual pupils, they've got everything at stake when they come to school. So we want to focus on learning, and we want to focus on the progress that they make. So we need those baseline and endpoint sort of data points coming in where we can get them. And we want to be able to talk about impact. And the intention is for teachers to be great evaluators of their impact and say, I can tell you that I have had this impact because of these things that I have intentionally done, as opposed to, this has gone really well. I really couldn't tell you what specifically made it happen.
So we're going to get on to impact in a moment, and I think the next one then comes. So, well, what do leaders, or what are they going to be expected to do differently to what they would normally do?
So the leaders, when we first meet with a leadership team and we go on the treasure hunt, we check what the school's aspirations are against the key strands of visible learning. So we say, the way I frame is that you have a magic wand or a wish list for the type of learners that you want to have. Articulate that learner to me. What does that learner sound like and look like? Describe it. And they say, so this is my aspiration. So, you've got a direction here. So then underneath you say, so what are the strategic plans that underpin that? Because you might have this, but your strategic plans might be over here. So have we got alignment? So we keep saying to the leaders, focus on these little bits here. And I say little, they're all consuming. Focus on these key aspects of visible learning and aim to get more alignment between what your aspirations are and your strategic plans. Below strategic plans, you've got the professional practices and shared understandings around the school. Do they align with what you want to happen? And does that align with your aspirations? So leaders are asked to consider alignment of the key strands to be able to bring about the major change, which is through the pupils. And that can sometimes mean your school improvement plan has all these things on. Let's take the bits that are to do with learning and let's really polish them and focus on them. And those other bits, you're still going to need to do them, but let's privilege the learning and make sure that's the main show in town.
So I'm going to invite Katie on in a second. But so what we're saying is we're going to change the language that we're using and the focus of that language onto learning. But then we're going to start really digging into what processes are in there and in place, and really understanding those and evaluating those and knowing how effective they are. And then also then what we're trying to do is get right down into the learners themselves and almost we're leveraging the work back onto them then, because we're now seeing what we're actually looking for, rather than worrying too much all the time about the curriculum and what we're delivering.
Yeah, that's it. The final part of the diagram that I was just building with my hands is I speak to the learners. I take student voice and I say, don't bring me your go-to children. Bring me just like your first, your fifth, your eighth, your 15th person on the register. Let me talk to them about learning, and let me reflect back to you where they're at. And we'll see if there's alignment between your aspiration and down here. And the 30% that you mentioned earlier, that's fairly typical in schools at the start. But when we're intentional about making the pupils become more like the aspiration that we've crafted, we get to 60%, we get to 90%, and we finish off in that final, third impact cycle where we get to all the pupils being there.
And it is quite a difference of just talking that language to getting into it. But I think the other fascinating bit for me watching it from the outside is seeing that the cohorts of pupils that they're expecting that are making the progress aren't the ones that aren't making the progress often. And in secondary education, this came through really strongly in the top 30%. They thought were making fantastic progress, because if you put them against GCSE or any kind of trajectories there, but when you unpick it from learning, it's a very different story.
Oh, it is. And one of the great breakthroughs is when you look at it, when you do the pre and the post test, and you look at the pupils who scored lowest on the pre-test, they tend to make the biggest progress in terms of we use an effect size calculator to quantify that. They get a huge amount of progress, but quite often, because they don't get anywhere near the finish line, they don't get celebrated. But when we celebrate the learning that's taking place and the progress that they're making in terms of becoming consummate learners, there's a much better celebration that we can have there than who crossed the line first.
Fantastic. Can I invite Katie in at this particular point before we get on to groups of schools and how they can work together?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So if you missed me at the beginning, my name's Katie and I'm the Client Relations Director here at Osiris. So I work alongside Craig and the Visible Learning team to implement Professor Hattie's Visible Learning programme, and that's into schools and across groups of schools. So if you want to know more about how we can help your school to implement visible learning, then I'd love to be able to help you. So I'll just pop my diary into the chat section of the webinar so that you can book an appointment with me to discuss this further. So I'll just pause now for 30 seconds whilst you book your appointment, and hopefully you should be able to see the calendar there right now. Thanks, everyone. I'll hand back to Craig.
Thank you. So we're going to be looking next at the intent of the programme for schools as well. And one of the things that I've been able to do, apart from working with small schools, I've been able to work with small clusters of schools as well. And one of the big celebrations that we tend to be able to have through the Visible Learning programme is to develop a greater level of collective teacher efficacy within school, but we also want to develop a sort of more collegial approach between schools as well. So where schools have got this system set up so that they can work with each other, there's a real good opportunity there to sort of have a thought partner in another school who's able to think about their impact compared to yours, so that you can coach each other as well.
I think we could even take this a bit further, because John went further on this one, because we know collective efficacy is the most powerful tool, and yet we can find virtually no examples of it around, which is kind of quite frightening. We know we've tried PLCs, TLCs to kind of limited success, really. So there's this notion that this collaboration should work, yet the effect size of collaboration is 0, which is quite astonishing, really. And it's 0 in any profession. It's not just in teaching. So it's kind of, well, why is this? And this is where John really dug in very deeply and said, well, let's design a process which is much more deliberate around that. And that's what for the groups and the trusts of schools, you can actually work across those, and then we've actually got a fully designed system which gives you a coalition of the willing, but also a coalition of the whole group, where you can look at the strategic process, all this information, and then embed all the learning right the way across. So it becomes a complete learning organisation rather than just the one. There are lots of individual entities.
It's true, and Michael Fullan, when he talks about how we sort of change the way this strategic view of the institution operates by getting each person within that to become strategic thinkers. There's so many moving parts, aren't there, in a classroom? Inside one person, a lot of moving parts, and across a school, the moving parts are there. But what we find with visible learning is that we've got processes that are scalable. So you can have an impact cycle that a teacher takes part in, and that's part of the visible learning interaction for teachers. So they do an impact cycle where they intentionally impact on something that they've gathered evidence about, and they become reflective evaluators of that. But then we have a leadership model that's like that within the school as well. So they develop an evidence into action impact cycle, and then we can have this across a range of schools as well. And because schools are more similar than they are different, it'd be quite easy for anybody coming to any school that I've worked with who's done visible learning and say, I really recognize what's taking place here. I know what's happened, and I can speak to you about this in a language of learning without having to think about, oh, what about all the teaching and all the pedagogical things? They're secondary to the learning, and that's why we get learning right at the heart of everything we do.
And I think when you were saying there with initiatives, Craig, because people get a bit scared. Most of these schools are just using it for initiatives they're already using, rather than trying to reinvent new stuff, because they've got so much happening anyway. The question is which bits are actually giving them bang for the buck, if you like, or producing impact, which we're going to get onto now. It doesn't have to be new stuff all the time. It can be what you're doing, but it's how you iterate what you're doing. And that word you used is how you align it. And remembering that alignment makes it easy for pupils to go through the system. Because if it's not aligned, they've got to do all the leaping around and move around. So they go from one teacher's feedback model to another teacher's feedback model to a third teacher's feedback model, and they're all just within one day, and they've got to make their way through it. Whereas once you start aligning these, it starts to become very much more powerful and easy to operate.
It does, and we get to a stage where 3 years into the program, schools that I've worked with who have sort of carried on moving forward with their impact cycles to fully embed it, they find that their teachers are doing less, but everybody's doing better. We're finding ways to be more confident, say there are things that we don't need to do anymore, but there are things that we need to do more of, and we're more critical as practitioners about where we need to be on that one. That allows teachers to rediscover that passion of why they came into the classroom, which is to have an intentional impact on learners, so that pupils can become self-teaching, self-correcting, self-improving. So can teachers, so can leaders, so can whole schools. And it does just scale up well, but we have to do it just slowly.
Okay, right, that's cool. So we're talking about impact there. Now, if you've got any questions, please just, we've got Craig here, so, please ping them in. But let's look at a little bit about what impact means. And I think, again, you've opened it out with the students, teachers, leaders, and the groups. Well, what's the difference then for students? What is that impact? What are we talking about by the word, even in the term impact?
Yeah, I mean, the spotlight's normally been on what's the attainment of the pupils, and visible learning is sort of born of attainment, because that's where all the research papers have sort of mapped intervention against increased attainment. But that's almost secondary to the other things that happen. So when you have a pupil who has agency, they're far more motivated to commit their sort of cognitive resources to a challenging learning task than somebody who's just chasing a high grade. The grades sometimes become an all or nothing type of competition. Whereas when you say the grades are going to look after themselves, my mum always said, look after the pennies and the pounds look after themselves. If we just focus on our progress, get the pupils, one of the impact events that I see is when pupils are able to start saying, right, there are some things about this I don't know. There are things here that I don't know that really I ought to know, and I'm going to work on that. And there are things here that I don't know, and I need the teacher to help me with that. And when pupils can start delegating to the teacher things that are tricky for them, but take on board what they need to do, I think that's the sort of impact that we're after.
I think the other bit I've noticed within the schools as well is you could take well-being, you could take agency, any of these kind of, what should we say, that they're more ephemeral constructs, but put them through visible learning, suddenly they start. I remember John saying that we had 7,000 qualifying bodies in Australia, and we had to get them all onto one scale because we wanted a national qualifications framework. So you've got plumbing on there, you've got health service provision, you've got educational qualifications, and all onto one scale. And they all said it wasn't possible. He said, well, you won't be on the framework then. If it's not possible. And suddenly then everyone has to start unpicking, well, what do we really mean by well-being? What does that look like as a progression? And visible learning gives you the structure for that, as well as all the learning ones, which is quite nice. So the impact then becomes something that is owned and contextualized within the school, but has real sense of specificity and meaning, and can be shared with the pupils, the parents, and other people around.
Totally. And those affective sides of education, I think that when we have a high stakes education system with regards to assessments, we forget those other bits. And it's only when we intentionally bring those back in that we then start having impact on the other bits. Because when a pupil has agency and has motivation and has been able to put aside those feelings of boredom, which have got a really negative effect size, then we can start moving forwards with what it is that the pupils do well. And we get them to reflect on themselves as learners and ask themselves, where am I at in my learning? Where am I trying to get to? And how will I get there? And that is transferable in near transfer into different subject areas, and then far transfer when they get out into the world beyond school as well.
Okay, I'm going to jump to the leaders here, Craig, then. So what's different for the leaders? What's the impact the leaders get?
The thing that I hear an awful lot is it's absolutely brilliant to be talking about learning. And certainly with the way that the pandemic is at the moment, where teachers and leaders have become public health experts alongside all the other million things they do well. But when we can get leaders to start saying learning is what we are here for, we're here to have impact on learning, and to really stand alongside the teachers and say, we're here together to help you, the learner, become as great as you can be. And everything about our school is here to do that. Schools change their purpose, their visions, their values to align with learning. And the more we focus on learning, it's interesting to see the more learning happens. We can focus on teaching, and just because we teach doesn't mean that pupils have learned. Whereas if we look at what learning is taking place, then we can start taking it back and saying, so what's actually making that happen?
Yeah, I come across groups all the time. They want to throw the curriculum out or change all these sorts of things. The first thing I say is just stop there for a moment. What's actually working here already? Yeah. And then the question comes, well, how do we know it's working? And this is, well, the impact of learning, because if we can see that, we can suddenly see what the contributors are to that progression and the contributors are to that journey. So, one of the things for me that leaders find is their job becomes a lot easier because they've now got an implementation framework. Instead of having those tricky questions like, oh, we want to have a reading dog in school, and it being about, oh, can we afford one? How many kids have got allergies? It's what impact would that make on the learning? Let's put forward a proposition. Let's run it through a proper impact cycle, try it out, and now we can adopt or not. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, we look at the evidence that we might use to be able to evaluate these things. Emotions are as valuable as data in everything that we look at as well. So we don't just come along with some sort of robotic analytical approach of, we can't do that because it doesn't achieve that. Every school's different. You have to just ask yourself, what's right for your school? And the numbers, all the research, that's just the starting point, isn't it? That just says, this is just describing what has happened, but it's not going to tell you that's what you're going to get. It's not necessarily predictive, but it gives you a good indication of what might happen. And you start from the numbers, and then you move forward, and then you look at your own impact.
So I think, hopefully here now we're starting to take quite away from John's research, which is just the probability of what will work, to, well, actually, this is visible learning is about getting right inside your organization, and it's pulling that process together. It's not about picking off that top list and saying, oh, we've got to put those in and it'll all work and it'll all be happy. I mean, the one thing John will always say is every teacher teaches differently. And we know this because they've grown up differently, they've had different experiences, and all the research points to say that they will go back to teaching the way they were taught. It's an overwhelming thing. They were successful at it, so they will replicate it with all its unconscious bias loaded into it and everything. Now, we can unwrap that and try and superimpose a model across, but it isn't really going to take much further. it's when we can actually unpick all this. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So just to end on then, Craig, I think before we move on, for the teachers, what's different when you become a visible learning teacher? You know, what would be different, and what do you see different at primary level and at secondary level? Because obviously, if you're dealing with examination classes, it's somewhat different from if you're dealing with younger students.
Yeah, and that's true right at the outset. But there are schools who obviously. The 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years into their program. So the pupils that are coming through have been had their learner superpower developed and polished all the way through. So they're teaching their year 11s differently from how they were teaching them when we first started, because you're at the sharp end of education once you get to the exam classes. But the things that teachers do start doing differently is that they start hunting out for feedback from pupils to help them to become even better at helping the pupils. You know, it's that that lovely dialogical model of if you can help me, I can help you. Through that, when schools are starting to really privilege impact cycles and doing evaluative programs within their school, you have permission to be brilliant. And that's the one thing that teachers discover. They have a leadership team who says, we are going to privilege this experience and privilege this program so that you can find out just where your strengths are and to really build on them. And where you've got things that aren't quite working, we can either abandon them, adapt them, or you can look for somebody else's input and adopt something else. But we're all on a journey to improve. And it's this ability to improve and to see yourself as capable of improving, rather than thinking, I'm a teacher now, there's nothing more for me to do. Teachers just go, I'm a great teacher and I can get even better. And getting better means that the pupils are able to take greater ownership of their own learning. So when we get to the end of the program, we should have teachers doing less, pupils confidently and keenly doing more, and the teacher then can help the pupils to reflect more on themselves as learners, how they got there, and think about what they want to do next.
Fantastic. Well, you've clarified so much about what it is. I know there's an awful lot more detail. Just in practical terms, what does the programme involve for a school? What's the level of commitment that they've got in there? And what's the residue coming out of it?
Yeah. So the program typically runs over a 3-year program, and that's in line with research that says 3 to 5 years really is what we need to look at, like with Vivian Robinson's work there. So we've got several parts to it. There are 3 leadership day seminars that we have. We have a foundation day for leaders so that they can understand the landscape of visible learning before we start moving forward. Tony Gardner says if you're going to build a high structure, you've got to make sure you've got deep foundations. So we spend time privileging the foundation day, and then we have evidence into action days. I say that there are 3 on there. That there's chance to have 4 and to have more if that's right for your school. We build impact coach capacity within the school, and these impact coaches they're not visible learning gurus. They're probably very interested in it, but they're capable of leveraging with another teacher more impact on learning than the teacher would probably be able to manage by themselves. And they do it in a coaching model, a non-directive model. And a lot of the visible learning work is non-directive. It's not directive. You must do step A, step B, step C. The whole school have over that 3 years 8 seminars that they can select from a suite of them. That there are some key components that we'll put in there, but there are other bits that you think, our evidence shows that we need to focus on these areas, so we can pop those in. We bookend the program with capability assessments right at the start, where I come in on the treasure hunt, or my colleagues come in on the treasure hunt, and we do it right at the end as well. So we do the pre-test and the post-test to see what's changed. And when we have consultancy days in there as well. Impact Cycle 1 takes about 18 months. We'll do the second one over 18 months as well. And then the third one, that's when you should be able to keep it going up in the air yourself with the capacity and capability in the school.
It's interesting because it's been going for so long. We're actually able to go back to those schools now. They started it 8 years ago, that journey. What do they value most? They value the process because it's so embedded. Yes, they've moved on to learning. They've got learning, but it's more about their own learning. And they keep the impact cycles going because now they have an implementation process which is both scalable and impactful, which is kind of, what you want.
Yeah, definitely. It's about, as you mentioned earlier, the iterations. So you want to do one cycle, but then you want to go back and you want to polish it with your second cycle. And then maybe your third cycle is what makes it truly embedded. Much better than just doing something, intensely for about 3 days and then never going back to it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of going back to invisible learning. Nothing drops. Once you're there, until you say, no, it's not working, then it gets abandoned. You're going to be revisiting. And that's what builds the alignment, isn't it?
It is.
Craig, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us today. I'm going to let Katie have the final word, but I'm just going to say massive thank you to all you coming along. And thank you, Craig.
Thanks, Stephen. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks very much, everyone, for attending. So I'll just leave my diary open on the chat. So if you do want to book an appointment, just so that I can talk you through how visible learning might look in your school or group, then I'd be happy to do that. So feel free to book an appointment. Thank you.